Hello, everyone. Uh, I'm John Paul Lederach, and I'm talking to you today from our home in Silverthorne, Colorado, in the mountains. I'm sorry I was unable to get this a little earlier to you. We've been a bit pressed with some recent evolutions of the pandemic in our family and taking care of a number of medical issues. So I hope my thoughts are not too discombobulated for you this morning. I'd actually like to start with a small poem from Hafiz um, titled The Key Dropper. It goes like this. The small man keeps building cages for everyone he knows, while the sage, who has to duck her head when the moon is low, keeps dropping keys all night long for the beautiful, rowdy prisoners. I think the poem in some ways speaks to the question of how to become a key dropper. And in its conclusion, whether we are the sage or a part of the rowdy prisoners. I know that this period of pandemic has felt a bit like being, as the words go, hunkered and locked down and held at bay in many regards. But it has at the same time, especially here in the United States and other places in the world, certainly unveiled many of the realities that have been so present and daily for too many people who experience the realities of exclusion and the needs of finding a place to call home in the midst of circumstances that show the deep differences between those with privilege and those without. And I think it points to, if we're talking about keys, it points to the realities of some of the things we need to face with greater clarity, deeper commitment, and more long-standing persistence in our field of peace building. I think these have to do with the questions of uh, the challenges primarily of belonging. Belonging in a world that is facing not only the rampant challenges of this current virus and pandemic, but the challenges of a globe um, under distress that we share and from which we draw life. You don't negotiate belonging, yet the way our current system is established, the fundamental right to belong on an earth to which none of us had a particular right to inheritance, but all of us were born to. Um, the way we have organized ourselves has, in fact, made belonging um, a question of inclusion and exclusion, around which, for many of us across this globe, negotiating our ways to the basics of belonging are the trials of survival. I think we need to aspire to a boundaryless world, a world that understands that we are deeply interdependent, that we are, in fact, and need to understand the degree to which we are a part of a human family, a global human family. Over the past year, because of some moving and travels our family has had, most of it prior to the pandemic, I began to listen to an audio collection of Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches. It's extraordinary that such a young man had such vision, compassion, and a capacity to act and mobilize. What I drew from a series of about a dozen speeches compiled in an audio volume and moved again by that soundscape in which I was a young boy coming into my teenage years, was his three concepts that he inevitably always went back to. Um, How do we face the challenges of what he called the fierce now, the demands of the urgencies that we experience and see before us, with the challenges of a vision that understands and sees what he referred to as the arc of the moral universe that bends toward justice? That is, a capacity to see this long arc, holding the fierce now and the long arc. And alongside of that, he had a phrase that he came back to quite often in reference to not only the people that he was mobilizing in the civil rights movement, but in reference to those people who were perceived to be in opposition and even enemies, very clear enemies in many regards of that movement. And he used the phrase inextricably bound, that we are inextricably bound together, ultimately, in developing this capacity to move toward the beloved community, a place where all of us who are born into the human family have a place, have acknowledgement, have love and access to the things that we need for a decent and dignified life. So the question becomes, as I was listening to those things, that we are again living in those kinds of moments where those three things are so apparent. I recently made mention of the word 60s in reference to the systemic racism that this country experienced and this movement that was about, of course, Martin Luther King Jr.'s work. And I realized by not attaching a century to the word 60s, that it could be equally true that one could imagine the 1960s, the 1860s, or the 1760s. And the same issues are with us. We face a particular challenge in peace building that I think too often we want to move quickly through the long grasp of history. Those of us with privilege have a short memory. Those of us who live with the realities of a history that has never gone away have a long memory. We sometimes appeal to empathy, but of late, if we take a serious consideration, there is a kind of a unique, almost exquisite distinction between empathy and compassion. Empathy, the neuroscientists tell us in their studies, empathy follows the neural pathways in our body and in our brain that are related to pain. And as we know, when pain emerges, we move quickly to kind of fix or dash away from that pain. Compassion, on the other hand, embedded, for example, in the wisdom and religious traditions, be it Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, share a common view that compassion is located in the gut, that it is located in the very makeup of what makes us a human being. And the pathways that compassion follows are inexhaustible. That's the exact word of one of the most renowned current neuroscientists, Richie Davidson, who makes a case that there is no such thing as compassion fatigue. There is, however, empathy fatigue because of its following of the pathways of pain. Compassion has this connection that we are moved by compassion. It has more of a verb connection in that it takes action. We are moved to alleviate the conditions from which suffering emerged. And this very movement is whole body. By virtue of that, compassion has connections into and across the pathways more connected to care and love than exclusively pain. And it is, I think, those pathways that we need to constantly renew and understand in the work that we do in peace building. The keys, going back to Hafiz's statement, the keys in many regards, as I see them currently, which is what I was asked to speak to, because your gathering in part is asking the question, what do we understand from what we have learned these months and about what is coming? The keys, I think, are 3 or 4 that I find particularly relevant. If we are to take seriously that belonging and the fact that we are part of a human family are non-negotiables. We need to re-understand, reconnect to the deeper aspects of the work and the engagement that we have. The 3 or 4 keys that I would see. The first is that we have had a tendency in this field to want to externalize responses to deep human conditions of suffering. So we're constantly looking to the question, how do we skill our way out of this? As opposed to the deeper question of how do we hone the presence necessary to stay with it. We need to insist on our persistence. This is a long journey. The urgent now will constantly be with us. We are inextricably bound, and we need to find ways to move from the quick fix to the patience necessary to stay with self and group reflection, and to stay with the long process of facing with courage the challenges that will consistently come forward. We will not skill our way out of this. We will need to find ways to be alongside and adapt to ever-changing realities that are likely to move at a quicker pace than our ability to change. That certainly has been the issues that we've been facing here in the United States of late. How quickly we were able to mobilize in the direction of quarantining, but how quickly fatigue set in that ultimately reduced the ability to think about the collective well-being. When we extrapolate that out to the global family, this becomes especially challenging. So one key, practice ways that you develop patience and persistence, as much or more than you being drawn to a quick analysis and the skills that fix it, because those tend to be passing and temporary. The second key is that we need an honest conversation about the source and the sustainability of change. In the past, we have tended to view the source of change as coming from external to situations of conflict. That has been the mainstay of a lot of peace building. I think if we took the words of the famous poet Seamus Heaney from Northern Ireland, who wrote that a farther shore is reachable from here, when he was referencing this notion of the ability to believe in healing wells in times when they do not seem apparent. What are the farther shores that we need to reach? We have typically thought about that farther shore in reference to people traveling to locations, and I certainly have been a part of that, where suffering is happening, which subtly sends the message that the resource for healing and for change comes from outside. That, I think, needs to be reconsidered, deeply so, and I've been saying that for decades. The second and most difficult shore to reach, the one that I think we're least able to face in our field, is the shore of our own responsibilities, self-reflection, and how much we ourselves are a part of the very systems that we're trying to change. This, in large part, comes with a view that suggests one of the core keys that we need to be thinking about, that open the door to the threshold of something that is transformative in a long-term understanding, is that outside answers need to diminish in order to give leadership to those who are closest and most proximate to the suffering and the points of suffering in their expression. We need to put local peace building in the lead. And we need to reconsider how we are in relationships of respect and dignity with those people who are most proximate to the challenges and often have deep learning and understanding about what needs to be done, but whose knowledge and learning has not always been valued. The final one that I would point out is that I think we need to be clear that this notion of patience and persistence over the long term places us in relationships with a variety of people in ways where we are entering a period of constantly evolving mystery, rather than entering a context in which we have answers to provide others that we ourselves are not willing to take on. We cannot be overly responsible because that is a position of privilege and superiority. And we have to understand that the pace of wholeness includes us. And in that pace of wholeness, of learning our way into wholeness, we have to redefine and recommit to relationships of understanding each other and the gifts that we bring, placing those who have suffered more and who are actually very often the artists of survival closer to the lead of everything that is being done than as recipients of the good nature and goodwill of others who are more privileged. And in that patience, we will need to understand that we do not control the future, but that we adapt and we live into the mystery. This is probably the single greatest lesson of the pandemic. People discovering that they did not control the realities of their life in the ways that they thought they did. And how quick we are to show the fingers of blame on someone else or some bad policy or some bad way that people were manipulating the situation for their personal good. All of which is true, but which means that the force of blame aims outward when at least 3 of those fingers point back. When we understand that we do not fully control the evolution of the future coming emergent into our lives, we will understand how much we are connected and interdependent with each other. And that is the single greatest gift of the pandemic. The understanding that our borders and boundaries have no capacity to control the major influences that will affect our world and our local communities. We will need to understand that our old models of simply convening a few people to represent many others will no longer serve us well in a place where we need to have boundaryless understandings of belonging, and where local initiative will often be at the fore of what it is that the global has to fully understand, and how it will be that we will come to the perspectives of innovating and evolving new ways of being in local and global conversations, and to develop the capacity to persist with love and compassion when suffering is around us and when we no longer fully know clearly what is happening and where it is going. This capacity to sit with unknowing is a part of honing the presence, the quality of presence that we bring to and with each other. And it is that key that unlocks the ability to develop a human community capable of facing together challenges that are not yet fully known. It is incumbent upon us, I think, to develop that quality of presence. Let me conclude with a small poem that was originally not fully a poem in Latin America. It came out of the work of Eduardo Galeano, who wrote it originally as an essay. I first heard it in the 1980s in Nicaragua, translated it some 10 years later in Northern Ireland in Corrymeela, and share it with you today as a way to conclude this small conversation. He was writing in memory of people who lost their lives when the dictatorship in Chile emerged and began to massively take over the country. Looking back to the people that he cared about, this Uruguayan poet and essayist wrote these words, which I often use the word nosotros in Spanish, we, as the title, since it came embedded in a homage to those who had lost their lives. It goes like this. We have the joy of our joys and also the joy of our pains, because we find little interest in the painless life that consumerism packages and sells, and we take pride in the price of so much pain that with such love we pay. We have the joy of our mistakes, the stumbling downfalls that prove our passion for walking and our love for the journey's path. And we have the joy of our losses, because the struggle for justice and beauty, the struggle for justice and beauty are worth the pain even when we lose. And more than anything, above all else, we have the joy of our hopes. In the face of disillusionment, when hopelessness has twisted itself into a faddish item for universal consumption, we continue to believe. We continue to believe in the startling powers of the human embrace. May your conversations go well. May you walk the path of justice and beauty. And may you take seriously the inexhaustible well of compassion as you hone the presence that will be necessary to stay with the long arc that bends toward justice in the midst of this urgent now. Thank you.